The following program is a speech given by Yuri Bezmenov, a.k.a. Thomas Schumann, a KGB disinformation officer who defected to the United States. The speech was delivered in Atlanta on March 14, 1985.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dick Backert, and on behalf of the Atlanta American Opinion Speakers Bureau, let me say we're glad you could be with us tonight. I will be your master of ceremonies for this evening's program. Before continuing the program, I'd like to depart briefly and let me address an issue of concern to many of us, and that is a vicious rumor circulating that conservatives, Birchers in particular, do not possess a sense of humor. Unfortunately, it's true. No, it is untrue. In an attempt to quash that vicious rumor, I'll tell a story that perhaps may be appropriate for this evening's speaker. It seems a Muscovite attempted to visit the bier of the late Konstantin Chernenko within the last several days and was turned away by a machine-gun-carrying guard who inquired of the visiting Muscovite, "Do you have a ticket to this event?" And he said, "Comrade, I have a ticket for the whole series." I told that story to our speaker, Mr. Schumann, at lunch today, and I also commented after telling him. He laughed, by the way, and I asked him perhaps Mr. Gorbachev would have a little longer tenure. And he looked over the top of his glasses and smirked and said, "If he behaves himself." I would like to now call upon the Reverend Mark Luthold, pastor of the Northside Independent Methodist Church, to step to the podium to introduce our speaker.
Our speaker has been personally involved with the worldwide propaganda efforts of the Soviet KGB. Like a true-life Winston Smith from George Orwell's novel 1984, Thomas Schumann worked for the communist equivalent of Orwell's Ministry of Truth, the Novosti Press Agency. Novosti means news in Russian. It exists to produce slanted and false stories to plant in the Western media. The term for this KGB effort is disinformation. Mr. Schumann was born under the name of Yuri Bezmenov in Moscow in 1939, the son of a senior Red Army officer. Consequently, he went to good schools. At the age of 17, he entered the Institute of Oriental Languages of the Moscow State University. After graduating, he worked for Novosti, then out of the Soviet embassy in India in a department called Research and Counter-Propaganda. Due to his growing disgust, he began to plan defection. In February of 1970, he disguised himself as a hippie. I've tried to picture that. He had beads and a wig on, and I think that's maybe how he did it, and joined a tour group to escape detection. He contacted the United States Embassy, and after a long debriefing by U.S. intelligence, he was granted asylum and went to Canada. Today, he is a political analyst for the Panorama Weekly in Los Angeles. He is married and has 2 children, and he's the author of 2 books. Here to tell us how the communists used the free world press, will you please welcome with me Mr. Thomas Schumann.
My dear American capitalists, or oppressed masses, whichever you consider yourself, I would like first, in the way of expanding my introduction, to show you several slides to introduce myself in a more pictorial way. That would explain you how a nice people like myself get into dirty business like KGB subversion. This is a small suburb of Moscow, a town which is called Mytishi, where I was born in 1939. You can see a typical decoration in any Soviet city, Comrade Lenin statue in the middle of the central square. In your mass media, in newspapers like New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Time magazine, or whatever existed before, Comrade Lenin was described as the greatest humanist, revolutionary, and greatest politician. Recently, United Nations celebrated 100th anniversary since Comrade Lenin's birthday. Now try, please, to understand that in the eyes of people who walk by, you see these Russians walking by, Comrade Lenin was a short, bald man with speech impediment who died from syphilis and who introduced the system of mass terror and concentration camps in my country, long before these beautiful ideas came to the mind of Adolf Hitler. You understand that Adolf Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Comrade Lenin established a system which killed 66 million of my countrymen. You understand the difference? And yet the government in Kremlin receives congratulation congratulatory telegrams from United States officials, from your presidents and vice presidents, congratulating us with the birthday of our murderer. Try to imagine this. Partly it happens because of your mass media and your perception of my country. This is myself at the age of 6 or 7 on the statue of another great politician, great humanist and peacemaker, as New York Times described Comrade Stalin after the Second World War. Even at the age of 6, I realized that Comrade Stalin is not a great peacemaker, and that I'm not living in a beautiful country of justice, equality, and freedom, and it doesn't take me a PhD in political science, like some of you Americans have to study for 6 years to realize what socialism is. I understood it at the age of 6, when communist propaganda tried to explain to me that America is our enemy, that General Patton is just about to invade our beautiful socialist country. My schoolmates were counting days and minutes. When General Patton is going to invade us? We did not believe that the United States is the enemy. We knew better at the age of 6. When Soviet propaganda tried to convince us that CIA dropped a little Colorado bugs on our beautiful potato fields to eliminate our potato crops, and we were instructed to go to these fields and search for these beetles, and we couldn't find any, neither could we find too many potatoes, we realized that it is not America which is guilty of our failures. It is our stinking socialism which makes even potato rot in fields. When they tried to convince me that America is the enemy, on my table I had American-made Spam meat, condensed milk, and egg powders from the Lend-Lease agreement. Now try to convince a 6-year-old child that all these delicious foods, which you probably don't appreciate these days, is supplied to me by the enemy. I didn't believe it. This is my father, inspector of land forces of Soviet army. He inspected Soviet troops stationed in such countries as Mongolia, China, Cuba, Czechoslovakia. He died in 1973. But his comrades right now, as we sit in this room, inspect Soviet troops, Soviet army, colonial army stationed in such countries as Cuba, Nicaragua, Yemen, Mozambique, Syria, Iraq, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia. You want more? There are more. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan, North Korea. You want more? Well, keep on sitting on your fat bottoms. There'll be more. Believe me. And your media, when they describe these countries, they refer to these countries as non-aligned countries, countries of the third world, or even some of your media comes with fancy names like liberated countries. In my country, sensible people call these countries betrayed countries, sold to communism, betrayed by your multinationals, by your banking systems, by your governments, by your politicians, and unfortunately I have to admit by you people, with your silent consent. Since my defection, 15 years later, more than 15 countries have been betrayed by you to communists. This is myself on the right with a naive, happy smile at the entrance to my college, Institute of Oriental Languages. I studied not only languages of India and Pakistan, Hindi and Urdu, but also studied music of India, literature, philosophy, even religion, media, communication systems. I even tried to look like an Indian when I was second-year-old student, and I succeeded, as you see. And it was encouraged because that small elitist school was designed to train future Soviet diplomats, correspondents, or spies. As every other Soviet student, I had to volunteer, quote-unquote, to harvest grain in Soviet collective farms, strictly according to the slogan, "Those who do not work shall not eat." You can see me eating, therefore I was working. And this is the area where Soviet students spend their vacation. It is called Kazakhstan. The picture I show to you now is taken from an American magazine, U.S. News and World Report. I show it to you as an example of monumental idiocy of your mass media. They call Kazakhstan Russia's breadbasket. I hope some of you realize that Russia's breadbasket is not Kazakhstan. Russia's breadbasket is Texas, Kansas, Mississippi, Ohio. This is my first assignment to India as a translator with the Soviet economical aid groups building oil refineries in India. At that time I realized already that what we were doing in India has nothing to do with cooperation, friendship. It has something to do with building carbon copy of Soviet socialism in India, the same socialism which we hated back home in USSR.